That is one of the things when you're dealing with newer writers or maybe writers who haven't broken in yet or who haven't really worked with an editor yet, that they get in their way a lot, they get in their own way, whether it's trying to over-polish something or perseverating over one line of dialogue. Is that something you run into quite a bit?
Well, you have to be careful of the perfectionism we mentioned earlier, because that can be an excuse not to get it done.
Sure.
And I think usually at the basis of that is insecurity. It's not going to be as good as I think it ought to be. I'm not really a writer. So I have a friend, acquaintance, who published his first science fiction novel when he was 23. There was never a second, because if there was one syllable wrong on a manuscript page, you would, instead of whiting that out and retyping, you would type the whole thing again. He would research it to death. He never got anything done. And it's not curing cancer, as Dick Giordano used to say. You get it done.
I also find that people will come to a course because they have a story they've been dying to tell their whole life, and it's obsessed them and it's got great personal importance, but it makes it impossible to critique that story, even if it's not structured well, or if they're getting in their own way. I mean, I always try to convince people, do that story second. Do this first one either about Spider-Man fighting Dr. Octopus, or about that day that you went to the fruit market and saw somebody shoplifting. Save the story of the great life story that will be the monument to your beloved relative for like the second or third, because I'm going to tear the shit out of it as everybody else in the class.
Yeah.
And you'll hate us, and you won't write the story.
Yeah. And I think that kind of ties too into, and I pulled this out of your book, Danny, the idea of
And Mike Manley's book.
And Mike Manley's book, right? Who did Draw Now, right?
He does.
Or
just
it's
draw.
not. It's
Just
right now. It's Draw.
Draw.
And the two of you combined to do.
Yes, we
this
did the
particular
first
book.
ever crossover trade magazine,
Right.
Where we did Right Now Draw, then we collected it and had both these shows.
And within that, you talk about sort of the planning process before the script, which I think also is some things that new writers struggle with if they're trying to go directly to script or just write directly to script. But the idea of this pre-planning, the beat sheet, kind of having the outline before you get into it, and that if that's something that everybody should sort of think about before they jump into script.
Yeah, speaking of those, you saw a picture of Danny's book and a picture of mine. I would like to call to your attention the DC Comics Guide to Creating Comics by Carl Potts, who is out there.
Does he have any copies for sale?
I saw some
Yes,
this
he
morning.
has
Yeah.
many copies for sale. It's a book that I read in manuscript, and on the basis of that, invited Carl to, as an artist. When I used to work with him, I was working with artist Carl. Writer Carl came later, but it's a very good introduction to everything in terms of technique that you have to be aware of. And the reason for technique and the reason for editors is not that we would impose a set of rules on you, because there are no rules. There are principles. There's stuff that usually works. But the reason for all of this is just to help you tell your story as clearly and effectively as possible. If you run into somebody who's an editor and wants you to tell the story his way, well, you have to be careful. That might be a very frustrating relationship. And not only have I worked with those people, I was one of them. The first time I got a staff job at DC, I thought, well, they hired me because they like my writing. So my task is to make every story look like I wrote it, which was really, really dumb. The best I could hope for using that modus operandi was a third-rate O'Neill. I wanted a first-rate Danny Fingeroth or Chuck Dixon or whoever. So eventually, I came to realize that being an editor is like being a teacher. That hot little Sweetie Honey there has recently retired from 50 years as a teacher, so hey, and
Congratulations.
I know.
How many noble professions do you have?
My job is to make the graded people look good. That's ultimately what an editor does. And sometimes that's the editor saying, you have to rewrite this. But you never say that unless you can say, here's what's wrong with it. A, B, C, D. I once knew an editor who had well, you keep writing until I'm satisfied. Not
Just
realizing,
only one editor like that?
yeah, but she was my girlfriend. Listen, Dan, it wasn't a comfortable relationship at all. And Jim Shooter fired her after a year. But that's exactly the wrong way to do it. And some people think that kind of thing is what an editor does. If I ask for changes in script, this was always my procedure. Here is what I think is wrong with this scene. You can convince me that I'm wrong. I will tell you a way that I would fix it if I were writing this. And if you have a better way, or even your own way of fixing it, that's what we want. But in case that doesn't work, here's another option. You don't just expect them to keep doing it until you're happy. That depends on what you've had for breakfast in the morning. You've got to try and make the work at least that objective. It's going to be a terribly subjective no matter what you do. Your own psyche is going to creep in there probably.
And some of it comes down to chemistry. You could hear the same critique from one editor and hit the ceiling, and from another editor and go, oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, exactly.
So much of it is personal.